everyone, and welcome to our webinar from the European Council on Foreign Relations on Demographics. I'm Agathe Demarais, and I lead the work at ECFR on geoeconomics and technology, and I'm delighted to be joined today by two wonderful speakers, Alberto Rizzi, who's a policy fellow at ECFR, and John Springford, an associate fellow at the Center for European Reform. So why demographics? Of course, there are many pressing urgencies at the moment and a number of crises going on around the world. But at the end of the day, we at ECFR also take a look at geoeconomics, and one takes a look at global economic prospects and long-term economic prospects. Well, they all boil down to two factors, to two determinants. It's all about demographics and productivity growth. And that's the reason why we're here today to discuss Europe's demographic outlook, poor demographic outlook probably, which is something that Alberto Rizzi discusses alongside potential policy fixes in his recent policy brief. Before I turn to Alberto and John to discuss these topics, three things on the housekeeping side. The first thing is that this webinar is public and on the record. The second thing is that a recording of this webinar will be posted on YouTube and on our website a bit later today. And finally, the third thing we wanted to mention is we'll have a Q&A at the end of this webinar using the Q&A function of the Zoom software. And as my wonderful colleagues from ECFR Events have just posted, you can read Alberto's policy brief at the link that they have provided. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to you, Alberto, to discuss your policy brief for about 10 minutes, essentially discussing the main topics that you outline in your report. So let's start with perhaps a scene-setting question, which I think will probably be very useful to understand the context of this policy brief. Alberto, what is Europe's demographic situation in a nutshell, and why does it matter for Europe's geopolitical standing globally?
Thanks, Agathe. Europe finds itself at the very late stages of a demographic transition, which is the process through which society moves from a period with high mortality rates and high birth rates, so the two kind of compensate for each other, towards reaching a situation where the mortality rates have significantly declined thanks to advancement in healthcare and economic development, but also birth rates become significantly lower, and in Europe they are already below substitution rate, which is approximately 2.1 children per woman. So Europe has already peaked in terms of its population as well as in its share of the global population, and the population is not only shrinking, but it is also becoming significantly older at a relatively high rate. 3 out of the 4 major Eurozone economies, Germany, Italy, and Spain, have already peaked and are set for a steep decline. France is still managing fairly good, but overall the continent is in decline. This matters a lot if you consider the geoeconomic importance of Europe, because an older population means a market that is less effective, where innovation comes at a lower pace, where consumption is relatively lower, and also where you have a significant lack of workforce, which means that you cannot power your industries that much. But at the same time, also if you put yourself into the perspective of potential trade partners, a shrinking, less productive, older market is not necessarily the place where you would want to sign an FTA with. And so this means that Europe's biggest asset, which indeed is the single market, is becoming less and less of a great selling point in terms of Europe's economic relations with the rest of the world. And it matters because in this regard, Europe is set to lose importance, share of global trade, share of global GDP, and kind of risks being relegated in sort of second division compared to other powers.
So it's all about a topic that we talk a lot about at ECFR. It's all about how Europe can remain globally relevant on the global economic scene. And that leads me to my second question, Alberto. If people are the power, and people are the power, definitely listening to you, what is the situation in other global economies, other global powers?
Well, the situation is kind of mixed according to the regions you would look at, and in certain cases, the specific countries. If we take a look at the major powers, well, the big difference with Europe is absolutely the United States, which is set to continue expanding its population well, at least until the end of this century, probably even beyond that. It still has fairly high birth rates compared to economies in the same state of development, and it's also extremely attractive for people from all around the world. If you normally ask where somebody would want to work, study, or live, they would quite likely tell you the United States, and we still have to see whether Trump's immigration policies would have a permanent effect. But the point is that the United States has a diverging trend compared to Europe. Then we have China, which is set for another steep decline in terms of its population and especially its working age population, but it will still remain one of the most populous countries in the world and still a major economic power, if not a superpower. Then just bordering China, we have India, which is the booming demographic story of the day. It's already the most populous countries in the world. It has a long and sustainable demographic dividend, which basically is the period where your working age population grows faster than the rest of your population. So you have way more workers relative to the children and the elderly. And this sustainable demographic dividend could pave the way for massive economic growth as well as industrialization and strengthening of the countries. And then we have Africa, which is the late comer in terms of demographic transition, and it's set to almost double its population in the decades to come, probably at a rate that its institutions and governments are not able to cope with at the moment. Slightly different stories. Then we have Western allies in the Indo-Pacific, which are struggling with the same issues as Europe. South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are all declining and elderly population. And probably becoming a second-rate power. Also, we have Russia, which is facing a significant demographic challenge, already had higher mortality rates than comparable European countries, and the war against Ukraine is also rapidly increasing the pace of its population decline, as well as high mortality rates from the battlefield scores and the brain drain coming from people that have emigrated. So this is a kind of perspective of the world's major powers at the moment.
Thanks a lot. And perhaps my final scene-setting question before I turn to John for some reactions and comments, and then we'll have a discussion between you both. So in your paper, Alberto, you propose a few policies for European policymakers to try to address the demographic challenge. Could you walk us through a few of these policies and also the rationale behind them?
Absolutely. The first thing European policymakers should consider is that we cannot reverse the trend. Europe is not to go back to booming population or birth rates that we haven't seen in decades. So it's more about tackling the challenges and the spillover of the demographic transition. And the first thing European policymakers should do is looking at the low-hanging fruit, which are the single market. Strengthening the single market, eliminating remaining barriers will provide a boost to productivity, as well as making the single market, which again is Europe's biggest asset abroad, remain attractive and relevant for potential partners in the rest of the world. The other low-hanging fruit is bringing back those that are not studying or working, and a lot of the women into the labor force and making sure they could find adequate jobs, possibly also retraining them. It would help find some of the missing workforce in Europe, but also help supporting birth rate, because we know that women that have a stable job and know that they can get back to a stable job after a pregnancy are more likely to have kids and also to maintaining an economic role. Then Europe should also look at technology and artificial intelligence in two ways. One, as a way to boost productivity, so they would make sure that even if you have a declining pool of workforce, you will still maintain a relatively high output. And at the same time, also automation and robotics can help in simplifying a lot of the physically demanding tasks on the workplace, which would allow Europe to maintain the elderly worker longer at the workplace, and making sure that this would limit the impact of aging populations on pension budgets and the fiscal system. And then Europe should look outside. First step, just outside of our borders, Europe should think about speeding up the integration process of currently candidate countries, as well as look at other options. For example, Norway, and if John allows me, also thinking about, if not reintegrating the UK, at least building a much closer economic relationship. And then it should look at the countries that are experiencing demographic booms, those that are already in a fairly advanced state like the Indo-Pacific, but also Africa, and those countries that would struggle in finding adequate jobs, but also infrastructure and services to a population that would suddenly double. And the most strategic investment would be in training and educating people in those countries to make sure that they would provide the workers that Europe needs, and they would be more easily integrated into the European economic environment.
Thanks a lot. John, I'm going to turn to you. You mentioned while we were meeting just before this webinar that you've enjoyed Alberto's policy brief and that you had comments, reactions. So essentially, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much, and thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody should read this paper. It's a great tour of the horizon, and the messages within it are clearly right. Europe's waning demographics do weaken its power, as well as cause some problems fiscally. There are other policies that are going to be needed to offset it, and the suggestions that Alberto makes are all sensible: strengthen the European economy, use migration flexibly, try and raise employment rates, pension reform and retirement age changes, and so forth. And as all good papers do, it prompted a whole bunch of further thoughts from me, which are kind of largely focused on European labour market issues, and then I've just got a few points on kind of the global power issues which the paper raises so eloquently. The first thing I wanted to say is just about demographic projections, and how often they're wrong, which is interesting, because you would imagine that something as big and broad as population change, that we should be able to project it quite well, but no, not really. And a good example is Germany, which is over the 2010s and 2020s completely defied the demographic projections that were made in the 2000s, because everybody knew that their population was aging and their birth rate had declined quite significantly. But essentially because of quite high rates of immigration, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe in the early phases, then the large number of refugee flows in 2015, 2016, and then a combination of Ukrainian refugees and a large number of workers coming in after the pandemic, it's completely defined the population projections. And that kind of leads me on to a point where I've had some disagreements with some kind of demographers and labour market economists, which is, I think there's too much scepticism about migration being an offset. And the argument is, oh, well, it can't do that much, and what are you going to do? You're going to have incredibly exploding immigration rates in order to be able to deal with population change and so forth. But I think some of the experience of Anglophone countries, which Alberto mentions in the paper, kind of defies some of these arguments. And if managed well, then essentially importing a lot of workers of working age can have some pretty big offsetting effects on population aging. But the key thing is that the flanking policies to that immigration have to be really successful, and that means labour market reform. And labour market reform has to be done in order to be able to make migration pay. And one of the big problems in Europe is that, in some European countries, not all obviously, but they're characterised by insider-outsider labour markets, where you have people in relatively good jobs. They're relatively projected, and so they're insiders, and then the outsiders are in the casual labour market without that kind of labour market protection. And quite often, migrants can get stuck in the latter, and there are policies that you can do to try and make that situation better. Obviously, these are not politically easy, but they can help. So loosen employment protection for insiders is one thing you can do, or you can instead instead extends employment protections to everyone. The problem with the latter course, obviously, is that it tends to curtail employment rates. And the whole point is to try and raise employment in the society to offset population aging. You can get rid of more professional qualification requirements. There's quite a lot of jobs such as tour guides and so forth, where there's a lot of licensing and professional qualifications that aren't really necessary. And by doing that, and also trying as hard as you can to make recognition of qualifications of migrants easy, then you're much less likely to waste the skills that migrants bring with them. And if you do those kinds of things, then you can see some quite rapid progression in pay, and that means that you're going to get more tax revenues as well. A further policy is making sure that there's strong anti-discrimination policy and that's enforced. The UK has not necessarily been anyone's policy poster child for quite a long time, but there's one thing where I think it has been a success and a bit of an outlier in Europe, where we see very quick earnings progression for newcomers, both before and after Brexit. The average earnings for EU and non-EU born workers in the UK now is the same as UK born workers. And by making sure that you have that quite rapid progression, then that helps to reduce social tension as well. A couple of other labour market things. Obviously, raising employment rates is something that Alberto talks a lot about. And I just wanted to make two sub-points about that, about things that you can do. And one is actually that feminism is just a big part of this. Northern Europe has better gender pay parity. It has stronger and more enforced equal pay requirements. There's shareable parental leave. And so that means that you just get more women working. And so it's important that that happens. And another thing is trying to raise the number of people who go to university, both because there's a bit of a university premium still. Also, the rise in university attendance that you get by expanding university tends to disproportionately help women. And so that helps to raise employment rates. And obviously that's been happening across Europe a lot, but there's still some laggards. Italy is the kind of number one sort of big, rich country there that's a problem. The other labour market point is about pension reform and retirement ages and so forth. I mean, one of the things that has happened in Anglophone countries is that a lot of the risk of retirement and longevity is being pushed from the public sector to individuals through private sector pensions. That doesn't necessarily help that much. It has a big distributional impact. So poorer workers tend to not save enough and tend to be relatively impoverished in retirement. It doesn't really solve the problem of fewer people of working age, and doesn't solve the higher healthcare costs that come from aging either. So raising retirement ages seems pretty unavoidable. And there are some things that you can do to sort of soften that problem, but there are limits to that as well. I mean, nearly half of people in their 60s get an illness or a disability that stops them from working. And then just a bit more briefly, I just wanted to make a few points on the power issue that Alberto raises, and the fact that Europe's weakening demographics sort of tend to weaken its power. And I just had 3 points to make here. One is I was really taken by the section on the military and the weakening security situation in Europe. And Alberto makes the point that large armies are difficult when you haven't got that many working age people. And so my immediate thought was, well, deterrence is delivered by military technological superiority, so invest in it. And that can act as a bit of a substitute for having a massive army. And the obvious thing there, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, is stop preferring national arms manufacturers, create a defence single market, get the economies of scale and innovation that comes with that. The second point I wanted to make on the global power thing was the power of attraction, and here migration can help too, because you get much closer ties to other countries via diasporas. There's also evidence that having a large diaspora in your country means that you tend to have higher trade with their countries of origin, and so that helps to cement alliances. And then the third and final point that I wanted to make was just about changing patterns of industrialization, and the sort of the points that Alberto is making about whether countries that are having these demographic dividends that he discusses can be the sort of the next big industrializers, and what Europe should think about that. And the paper rightly says that, you know, a lot of other emerging and developing economies are getting a bit fed up with China because it's dominating global manufacturing markets so much. So, you know, Indonesia, India, Nigeria, Egypt, and so on. And I think Europe should want them to industrialize more, particularly because of its demographics. Actually, I mean, if you have fewer workers, one thing that you can do is substitute workers in your own economy for imports. If you don't have enough workers, then you can satisfy consumption that you need through imports. And so industrialization of these countries is important. There are things that you can do to help that along, which we could discuss. And because, you know, these sort of non-China emerging populist countries aren't quite so big and such huge strategic competitors, they are kind of partners that pose fewer systemic risks to European liberal democracy. So, you know, I think there is an external dimension there in terms of how the demographics and global trade policy link up, which I think it was a really interesting part of the paper, which I think everybody should read. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot, John. Well, I'm going to have a question for you both, actually, to kickstart the discussion. Before we do that, one word about the fact that we'll have a Q&A in about 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please do feel free to post it in the Q&A box of the Zoom software at the bottom of Zoom. But first, listening to you both, you know, so, okay, so the demographic situation of Europe, well, isn't great. The outlook isn't great either. I would suppose one fix that would come to mind, and that sounds very easy, would be pro-natalist policies. Hungary spends 5% of its GDP on such policies. What's your respective takes? And this is something that's discussed in the paper also. What are your respective takes on the challenges that these policies face, and potentially their successes? I know Russia also has some similar policies. Perhaps Alberto, do you want to start, and then John, you could continue afterwards?
Yes, thank you, and also thanks, John, for the nice words about the paper. Yes, Hungary spends 5 or 6% of its GDP on a set of measures to increase birth rates. So that's very generous tax schemes for new moms, as well as like child benefits, but that's barely worked. Its birth rates have almost not shifted after the introduction of those policies. And that is one of the risks that we have to consider. The paper doesn't argue against also favoring domestic birth rates, but it's fairly skeptical because the data we have tend to say that they won't change much. And the demographic, the decision by women to have less kids is a global phenomenon by any means. It crosses cultural, religious, regional boundaries. The main difference is that it starts from different levels. So in Africa would mean they will still have 4 or 5 kids. In Europe means they're gonna have none. But it's very difficult to move them, and it's also very expensive. So you're gonna put a lot of money into something that doesn't necessarily turn out to have a result. And most importantly, economically speaking, you would see the results in 20, 25 years, more or less, when the people join the labor market. Before, there's actually no positive effect. So that should be done in parallel with migration, because as John rightly pointed out, demographic outlook are not always certain. They can be wrong. Sometimes they're wrong for the better. More often they're wrong for the worst. But the point is that up to 2050, we can take more or less them for granted. And so what can change our migration patterns? Countries that become more attractive, that are able to bring the best talents towards their economies, are the ones that tend to gain most.
And perhaps before we turn to you, John, something that I found really interesting and intriguing in the paper. So was, Alberto, you mentioned that birth rates moved a tiny bit in Hungary after the introduction of such policies, but actually afterwards, we saw that women were having children earlier but it doesn't mean that they will have more children. They would just, shift the timeline, which I found really interesting. So I think that was interesting to keep in mind. John, what's your take on these policies? There was also a very good, interesting piece in The Economist on this lately.
Well, my take, I share the skepticism of Alberto, really. I mean, I suppose just looking across countries, there doesn't seem to be any real obvious correlation between having a kind of pro-natalist set of incentives and birth rate. I mean, if you think about Scandinavia and Germany, which have, very good, relatively good childcare, relatively good paid parental leave. I think it's 2 years for men in Germany, and the same for women. Then you have pretty low birth rates. If you look at the UK, which has absolutely awful childcare and provision, better than the United States on parental leave, then it's a little bit better. And then if you look at the US, which is just awful in all respects, then it's better still. So it doesn't seem as though those kinds of policies are likely to have much impact. And I'd also just add one thing, which is that I was intrigued by that point about Hungarian women deciding to have children earlier too, but having the same number. And I think there is a little bit of a trade-off here, in the sense that you can raise employment either by having more kids, which, as Alberto says, will come at quite a big lag. But we also know that having children, there's a pay penalty across most countries for women for having children because of time out of the labour market, and so there are offsetting costs to those policies as well. So I'm sceptical that pro-natalist policies will move the dial really at all.
So turning to migration, which is obviously a big topic and certainly a politically contentious topic. Something that we discussed in the past, Alberto, is the point you were making to me is that raising birth rates isn't the same in terms of impact as having higher migration. I'm not sure that I'm saying this right. You're the expert here, but I wondered if perhaps you could say a few words about this, and then John, if you also have anything to say about this, whoever wants to go first.
Yes, I mean, the main difference would be that with migration, if it's done strategically and pragmatically, you have like ready-made workers into your economy, while increasing birth rates means you increase the domestic population, and in a generational time frame, you would have more workers and more consumers. But the difference that between the birth and the entry to the labor market, those are dependent populations, so they have to be said very brutally, they have a higher cost than benefit to the economy, while workers would immediately start producing and consuming, and at least at first they don't come with the families, so you don't introduce other dependent into population. The two should go hand by hand in my view about fixing it. Just that people should keep in mind that the effects would be immediate in one case and a bit more delayed in time in the other.
John, I see.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that, apart from the point that higher immigration can also support your birth rate, in the sense that quite a lot of people that migrate tend to be in their 20s and 30s. So, if you're bringing in more people who are around the age when they're about to have kids, then you're likely to get more kids. And we see that effect in many countries that have relatively high migration rates for a period. You also see that the birth rate in the country rises as well.
Finally, perhaps one more question from me. So Alberto, in your policy brief, just after the introduction, you start with the bold idea that Trump could actually help Europe from one perspective, which is attracting global talent from the tech fields, people who are working in the US at the moment, but don't find that it's a particularly welcoming environment to work on some specific topics in particular. So I wondered if you have any thoughts about this, John, Alberto, about how Europe more broadly perhaps could also try to attract high-skilled workers and how the current context could be reshaping this situation? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I mean, one of the points that I make is that, I mean, it's still early to see if those attitudes, both in terms of draconian migration, anti-immigration measures, but also the clamp down on universities and research institution in the US is going to have a structural effect on their attractiveness, but it's definitely something Europe should seize the opportunity and should try and make sure that people that are skeptical about the US, either of moving to the US to conduct high-level research or tertiary education, would instead look favorably at Europe as a better environment where there's still a lot of institutions, plenty. I mean, we're not short absolutely of top-level university of high-rated research institutes in Europe, but we're still considered less attractive compared to the US, and we should seize the opportunity and make sure promising people that might be pushed out of US universities that here they can find the adequate environment. It means providing universities and institutions with adequate funding, but also easing the entry policies for high-skilled worker and creating a shared system. Europe has a blue card system, but if you look at the number, it's very, very low, and 2/3, 3/4 of them end up in Germany. So there's not a kind of adequate sharing in this regard. I understand why they want to go to Germany, especially from an Italian perspective, but at the same time, an easy system that allow them to move more freely once they get into Europe and pursue their research dreams would help. And I mean, Europe should do whatever it can to attract the best and the brightest.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of in two minds about this, because I mean, one obvious difference is that salaries are just so much higher in the United States, so particularly in the university sector. So in order to kind of really attract a lot of academics, particularly scientists from the US, then funding for universities is going to have to go up quite a lot, I think. And obviously, there's still some very well-funded institutions in Europe, but it's not, you don't have the same volume of extremely well-funded institutions that you do in the US. And so in order to be able to make it properly attractive, you're going to have to do something big. And I'm not sure we're necessarily seeing that. And then the other point I'd make about the US is it kind of depends, right? At the moment, there's a very unpleasant bargaining process going on between the Trump administration and universities. We don't know how that's going to play out, and I think for a lot of academics who are subjected to that, then it probably a wait and see approach is what they're going for. And if you do end up with a real slide into authoritarianism in the United States, then maybe you'll see more people wanting to come to Europe versus the US. But I think it would be relatively tricky to be able to get them straight away and in large numbers. And then the other point that I'd make is just to reiterate my points about the labour market before, that it isn't just university researchers that we're talking about. We're also talking about people of middling to high skill who work in healthcare and work for healthcare systems, radiologists and so forth. The more that you can say, okay, you can come and your skills are going to be recognized easily and quickly, and you'll be in a job quickly, and you've got good pay progression opportunities, the more likely you're going to be able to attract these people. And you can attract much richer people through some of the sort of golden parachutes, I guess, type policies. But if you really want to make a difference to the economy as a whole, then you need to be thinking about people who are sort of middling and upper middling levels of skill as well.
Thanks a lot, both. I see it's time to move to the Q&A, and we already have a few questions in the Q&A chats. So actually, John, I'm going to turn to you for a first question. And for full disclosure, these are topics that we all discussed with other people also during a workshop in Brussels a few months ago, and we had some fascinating exchanges. And one of the topics that we discussed was how governments can help women get back to work after a pregnancy, which is not something that is very easy, but probably crucial to boost birth rates. And I wondered, John, if you had any views about tried and tested policies that are useful in this regard.
I mean, this is really not my area of expertise, but the it's pretty clear that having strict employment regulation, which prevents discrimination of either women of childbearing age or women who have recently had children, that is absolutely crucial to ensure that their subsequent career progression is protected and their jobs are protected and so forth. And that's certainly an employment protection which you should extend to everyone, and one that you should not get rid of whatsoever. The evidence on childcare, I think, is pretty good. I mean, for a lot of people who are having to pay large sums for a prolonged period after they've had a child, then a difficult dilemma between essentially losing an entire month's salary in order to be able to pay for a child, or just not working and looking after the child at the same time. Not working and just deciding to look after the child full time. That dilemma is more likely to have an impact on less skilled, less well-paid people. And one of the things that we know about the labour market is that the longer you are in less well-paid jobs, the more likely you are to continue to be in them. And so, pay progression tends to stall out basically once you get into your mid-30s, early 40s. So, it's really important to ensure that, if possible, people can get back to work if they want to, and that they are able to then progress into, more senior roles and well-paid roles.
Thanks a lot, Alberto. I'm going to turn to you with a question about China's demographic outlook. So you've mentioned the country, but I wondered, and that's also a question that we got, whether you would like to say a few more words about China's demographic outlook and potentially the policies that the Chinese leadership is considering to boost birth rates in China.
Well, China has absolutely horrible demographics, and in certain cases, they are even worse than the European ones, because they're now facing the beginning of the retirement of the parents of the one-child policy, which kind of ensured on one side that they had a very rapid and substantial demographic dividend, but at the same time that this generation would not be replaced by an equally big cohort in a very particular moment where China is also experiencing low domestic demand and low consumption level. And China still now has some of the lowest retirement ages in the world and has basically no elderly care system on a national scale. And that means that the brunt of the support would have to be bared by the families, which will not have enough resources to dedicate it to that. And this means that the size of Chinese economy is in serious question because of that. And the point is that the government seems to be doubling down on the past, so not investing enough in domestic consumption, because that would trigger some problematic political question for the Chinese Communist Party. And the same goes for migration. Chinese leadership absolutely refuses any idea that migration can be a fix to its demographic woes, and insist on having an almost single ethnic state, as China more or less is now. And so they're betting massively on automation as the fix to all the issue. We're not going to have work as well as robots going to produce stuff. Yes, but robots don't buy cars, TVs, or refrigerators, and so those products would have to be dumped elsewhere abroad, increasing the issue of Chinese overcapacity and the anger and resistance by countries that are on the receiving end of that dumping.
John, I don't know if you have anything to add to this. Please feel free. Else I can turn to another question. Up to you.
I haven't got anything huge to add. I mean, one of the really tricky things for China is, as an economy, it needs to move from extraordinarily high saving and investment rates to consumption. One way that you can do that is by trying to expand a welfare state, which is pretty limited in China. More public healthcare, more public sector pensions, and so forth. And then that means that the sort of the extraordinary savings rates that you see in the population are going to be more limited, and there's going to be higher consumption and so forth. But it seems as though the government, just finds this almost impossible to consider. And as Alberto says, that means that some of the demographic problems that it has are made even worse, because if you have a model which is entirely about building lots of stuff for exports and not just trying to essentially satisfy the consumption demands of your own people, then you're going to end up with a kind of warped economy towards very high savings and investment rates. And you're not going to be able to do these things which are going to help to raise consumption and also help with some of your demographic issues. So it will be interesting to see what happens, but I share Alberto's pessimism about China.
Perhaps I see that we're verging towards the end of the webinar, but we had a question about the global demographic outlook. Will the global population keep rising? Or actually, will it peak at some point? And I remember, for those of us who have read the report, I know the answer is in the report. But I wondered, Alberto, what's your take on this one? Acknowledging all the caveats that John mentioned about the fact that forecasts are actually going to be proven wrong. That's absolutely certain.
No, the global population is set to keep rising more or less until 2080s, something like that, where it's supposed to peak and then start around 10 billion people, and then start a decline that is not particularly steep. So there's like kind of plateauing downwards in a certain way. And this is something that's like, of course, we don't know for certain because projections are only as good as we can make them. But the important thing is that contrary to a lot of commentators of people on social media that are keep talking about the end of humanity or like a disappearance of the human race on Earth, that's really not going to happen. We're peaking and then we're probably slowing down to 8 billion people and perhaps further decline afterwards, but there's no implosion in terms of demographic. It's more of like a growth plateau and then the beginning of a decline.
Thanks a lot. I see that we're nearly at the end, so let's end here to keep the webinar short and crisp, which is how we like them at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So thank you so much, John and Alberto, for joining us today. For all of you in the audience, please download Alberto's policy brief. I know that our team has shared the web address in the chat box. It's really a great read, and I very, very highly recommend it. Please send thoughts, feedback, questions our way. We were delighted to have you all join us today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.